Thank you to Ingrid and Matits and everyone who has convened us here for the wonderful couple of days that we all get to spend convening and talking about our common future here in Oslo. I have the pleasure and the honor of serving as president and artistic director for the Sphinx organization. I myself am by trade a violinist and a pedagogue, born in Moscow and grew up in Azerbaijan. So I have a very ancillary kind of a connection to the United States and Blacks and Latinos and the story of diversity, which I'll try to share a bit as we spend a little bit of time this afternoon. Sphinx is the Detroit-born, Detroit-based national organization based in the US with a global reach, whose mission it is to transform lives through the power of diversity in the arts. And I titled the session No Sound Barriers to talk a little about what is empathy, reciprocity, and connection amongst human beings without regard to creed, race, color, and beyond. And as much as there are historical barriers that may otherwise separate us, as much as there are beliefs today that may separate us as different types of people, the point of this talk is to say that we are more alike than we are different. So as I said, the mission, transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. Now, for Sphinx, the genesis behind founding Sphinx more than 20 years ago has been that we noticed a lack of participation and representation of minority groups, which is an outdated term now, but still a way to conventionally denote folks who are not otherwise involved and represent an ethnic minority, but unfortunately also represent a minority within our field. So it's always important to kind of quantify that, and for me, I'm sometimes inspired by authors and different quotes. This one's one of my favorites. It's by an American novelist and author, Wallace Stegner, when he says there's a sense in which we're all one another's consequences. And I think it goes to kind of recognizing the importance of decisions that we make or don't make as leaders, as community leaders, as students and artists, and how what we do very much is connected not only to our own present and future, but also to our greater society and certainly to the next generation of artists and audience members. So Sphinx started 20 years ago, and it was inspired by the fact that we would find that our orchestras, our music schools, our conservatories, our musical settings of every type lacked diversity. It was rather monochromatic, and we began to ask the question of why. Of course, the initial conversation that I would have with many of our early mentors would be, well, the talent is just not out there. Well, it's really not an embraced tradition, and there's not a history of tradition in classical music with communities of color. And you begin to question that. You begin to wonder whether that's really the case. And it's not by happenstance that I have a picture of the great Isaac Stern here, because back in 1998, when he traveled from New York to come see our initial inaugural Sphinx competition, his words were literally, "Thank you for inviting me. I had no idea this young talent exists." So in other words, it was new to the icons in classical music that there's a plethora of young musicians who are talented and motivated and empowered and inspired, but also highly skilled. So it was sort of, for us, it was the beginning of establishing this ideal that inclusiveness, diversity, inclusion does not mean in any way a reduction of an importance on excellence or merit. And that's really an important tenet of Sphinx's. So it's always important to kind of quantify and say why Sphinx and why diversity amongst all these problems that we have, especially in our country at the moment. Why focus on diversity? And it's always, there are numbers, and luckily there are well-tracked statistics, which I'll just shed light upon just a little bit. So in the United States, Blacks in our population represent now a little bit more than 13%, and Latinos, again, closer to 17% now. But in American orchestras, as compared to the population representation, it's less than 2% Black and less than 2.5% Latino. Now, it should be important to note that over the past 20 years, these numbers have nearly doubled. But again, we've got a great deal of the ways to go. And we're often asked, if you're working on inclusion, why not include all minority groups in all of your efforts? And that's a legitimate question. Particularly, I get that question a lot from our global partners, and in particular relative to Asian Americans. But I'm happy to share that it's just not an area of focus for Sphinx, because in fact, as compared to population representation, the Asian American community is overly represented, both in the academic world, in conservatories and music schools, but also in professional orchestras. So of course, orchestras are very complex organisms, and it goes beyond who's on stage and who's actually delivering the art form. Beyond that, of course, we've got our artistic leadership, music directors and conductors, who represent statistically less than 2.5% amongst Blacks, and very much actually less than 1% amongst Hispanics. Executive directors, this is our ultimate leadership. These are folks who lead the way and hopefully actually establish what the future of orchestras is going to look like constructively, and kind of looking at the piece of relevance. And there we have Blacks at less than 0.5% and Hispanics at less than 8%. Artistic administrators, these are our liaisons between music directors and the community that we're supposed to be serving through orchestral music. And there we have a statistical 0. So you could see how statistically, still as of last year, as measured by the League of American Orchestras, subscription series programmed by American orchestras represent less than 1% of all music that we program all throughout the season are represented by composers of any color. At this point, I'm not even talking about Blacks or Latinos, I'm just saying of any non-white composers. So we've got a long way to go through our work. Education and community relation directors, this is code word for liaisons between communities, young people, and everything that falls outside of subscription series as connected to the orchestras. So this would be an area where you'd see the most amount of diversity, except not in statistics. It's still abysmal. Blacks, about 3%, Hispanics, less than 2.5%. So it's kind of based on these kind of statistics and this kind of data that it became very clear that there's a very much a needed and an urgent need and a void in our field, and somebody had to step in and do something about it. So it's kind of based on these kind of statistics that were even more stark back 20 years ago, or 21 now, that Sphinx was launched and born in response to this disparity, and really with the aim of creating a platform that provides equal opportunities for young people from disadvantaged communities, and where arts are made accessible, available, attractive to young people of any creed, race, or color, so that we could have the advantage of the arts be something that everyone has access to. So here I've got a short video to kind of illustrate a bit more about the scope of our programming and what we try to do throughout the year, and the way in which, over the past couple of decades, our programming has grown. The perception that the talent isn't out there within communities of color is so deeply false in classical music.
Wow! Drop the mic! There are millions of kids like this in this country who do not have the resources to become everything that they could be. But fortunately, these programs are doing the job that the bigger society fails to do.
Sphinx's mission is transforming lives through the power of diversity in the arts. And we address the issue of lack of diversity and inclusion through a sense of a pipeline. We have Overture program replace violins in the hands of young people for the first time.
I definitely believe that the Sphinx Overture program has made a difference in this community.
The Sphinx competition is our flagship program. It's a wholesome approach to musician development that goes beyond the competitive mechanism. Sphinx Connect is the epicenter for artists and leaders in diversity, devoted to the issues of inclusion, leadership, and career advancement. We have Sphinx Symphony, which is a professional, all African American and Latino orchestra. And then we have the Sphinx Virtuosi, which is an ensemble of soloists that performs across the country, everywhere from Carnegie Hall to Harris Theater in Chicago, and really communities beyond.
I think the Sphinx organization is so incredibly important. it tries to achieve in our society an equilibrium of people who are incredibly talented and motivated to be part of every aspect of our society.
Sphinx has done tremendous work over its first 20 years. And I think that over the next 20 years, Sphinx will truly transform the lives of millions of more people.
So here, kind of very much, there's been an elevated level and volume of conversation about inclusion and diversity, in particular now in the States, where there's much that separates us, and sometimes the difference that we find as human beings makes it kind of difficult to assume that we'll find things that are in common. We very much believe at Sphinx that the arts are very much that bridge, that vessel through which we find commonality. Some of the recent research that I've seen coming out of University of California as recent as last week actually is a little bit disheartening. And it states essentially that the crude conclusion of it is that elevated level of conversation does not really create change. Just because we're talking about issues, it does not make issues get addressed or doesn't make them go away. So I don't know if I wholeheartedly believe it, because unless you bring issues to the surface, how does one fix it? Unless there's frank conversation, how does one address it? So I still believe in it, which is why we continue to talk about it. But beyond talking, another one of my favorite quotes from Leonardo da Vinci about being impressed with the urgency of doing, but knowing isn't enough. See, the thing is, many times, especially in the States, we talk about we need more data. We just don't know enough. We have all the data in the world. We know that, for an example, another way in which kind of I think about it is that classical music, very much universally, but so true in the States, has for a long time been telling an incomplete story. And the danger of an incomplete story is just that. It's not that it's false, it's not that it's not true, but it is incomplete. And I think we could all these days benefit from a completed story, one that involves voices from various communities and makes it that much more rich. So in fact, how is this relevant to our young audiences? I have a few examples to talk about. I think one of the ways in which at Sphinx we view our audiences is very much reciprocal. We think about our audiences same as we do about our artists. In fact, it's the same constituency, because through our very work throughout the year, school year as well as the summer, we are building new audiences. Hundreds and thousands of young people whose lives we touch will never become virtuoso violinists or members of any orchestras, but they will, and they are, becoming our audiences. So I think about it, and I think that audiences are simply mirrors into the art and art making that we're able to experience as artists and leaders. Leading is not a solo art. We must build ensembles. So one of the ways in which Sphinx does this work is that we have more than 100 partners just in the States alone. To accomplish the work that we do, we could never do it through that kind of sense of augmentation of a mission unless we had the support of and the creativity of our community partners. So we partner with about 20 music schools, more than 30 orchestras across the country, and hundreds, literally hundreds of community centers who foster that kind of relationship with the communities, and they literally help us curate our programs. Every year, we host a concert that invites 20 or 2,000 young people into the concert hall in Detroit. And the way in which they participate is that, yes, they view the concert, they get to ask questions of the orchestra and the conductors and the winners of the Sphinx competition, but on top of that, they get to select their own audience choice winner. So in many ways, it gives them that early exposure, not only to role models and artists who look very much like them and are of a similar age. These are kind of primary to early middle school aged young people, but they also get this early experience to curate and judge art and decide for themselves what is good and what's impressive and what kind of deserves that recognition. Our finals concert, which is this nationally broadcast large concert that is a culmination of a global convening that we do every year in Detroit, which attracts 600 artists, artist administrators, pedagogues, teachers, leaders from around the world who all come together to talk about the importance of inclusiveness and the kinds of challenges that they each respectively experience in their communities, sharing best practicing, and some of the challenges which may or may not have immediate solutions. For the finals concert, almost half of the hall is filled with young people who all come to the dress rehearsal. They experience the rigor of that dress rehearsal. They meet the finalists of the competition, members of the orchestra, and then they get to watch the whole concert in process and in progress. Sphinx Virtuosi is our main traveling touring ensemble. In fact, their tour just ended in Detroit the day before this conference started. And I have to say that one of the ways it's been a joy for me to work with this ensemble is that every year we think about a theme that corresponds with kind of some of the social issues and political climate that goes on in the world, and we create a program together. We co-curate a program with these young people that will respond and attempt to be relevant to our various audiences to whom we're hoping to bring this music. And when we do that, these young people not only present the music, they also speak to the audiences between each one of the performances. They introduce the piece, they talk a bit about the history of the piece, and we do so bilingually because with a growing Hispanic population in the States, it's really important to us to be able to literally speak the language and be able to relate to people in a way that's direct and their own. And then in terms of programming overall, the way I think about our programming is that it's nothing unless it's relevant, right? And it's relevant today because I think about how far we've come and how long we have to go. In 1964, the year of the Civil Rights Act passing in the States, and the Civil Rights Act was literally the law that prohibited discrimination against people depending on their creed, race, sex, religion, etc. So 1964, civil rights law passes. The New York Philharmonic, arguably one of the most important, certainly one of the oldest orchestras in the United States, hires its first black member. Today, in 2017, the New York Philharmonic has one black member. In 1967, a couple years later, the Carnegie Hall, for the very first time in its entire history, presents the first racially integrated orchestra. Today, we just saw the statistics where we can hardly call ourselves racially integrated. So in other words, this work not only remains relevant, it's that much more urgent, because if we're not inclusive, pretty soon we're going to become irrelevant, with a growing population in our urban centers and our capitals certainly shifting very much toward majority minority. So because of that, we feel now more than ever it's important to continue to integrate that thought into our art making. And then finally, some of the impact we've been able to have among artists. So among the various programs that we integrate throughout the year, I think one of the more impactful areas for us has been fostering careers of minority musicians who are themselves aspiring not only to augment Sphinx's mission, but establish themselves as portfolio artists, as entrepreneurs, and leaders. Through our Artist Grants programs, we've helped countless of other musicians of color establish new nonprofits, code word for charity work, new educational organization, each one of whom then goes into their communities, goes back to their communities as ambassadors for that sense of inclusiveness being important, but probably more than that, that sense that when you have inclusive leadership and when you have representation from communities of color, it does not in any way mean diminishment of artistic merit or that importance and commitment to excellence, something that we're still trying to advocate for and prove back in the States. So over the past 20 years, Sphinx has focused very much on providing opportunities and enforcing opportunity at every phase of this pipeline sense of a career. So 100% of our competition laureates have gone on to major music schools and conservatories. We've been able to have 27 of our musicians now play in professional orchestras in leadership positions. Through our global scholarship program, we reach approximately 13 countries, now 15 as of this year. We've launched 2 professional orchestras and 2 quartets, but I think more importantly, it's where we need to go. Over the next 20 years, we hope to get to 20 commissions. We hope to double the number of communities we reach, expanding our audiences, involving our audiences, and really looking at ideally 20 years from now. I know it's not going to happen, but the vision is that Sphinx and its work may become irrelevant because we will have achieved what is an integrated society and an integrated field that really thrives and serves its communities as much as it benefits from the community and their reciprocal involvement. So that's kind of the story of Sphinx and where we hope to go. I'll close briefly with one of my favorite quotes that really goes back to that sense of not only recognizing something is important, but doing something about it. And that is that change does not roll on the wheels of inevitability. It comes through continuous struggle. History will have to record that the greatest tragedy of this period, and unfortunately this period still being relevant today, was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter. And I submit to you that inclusion, diversity, involvement, and reciprocity in our field, if it were to not only survive but thrive, matters. Thank you very much.